Hello friends, welcome back to my channel Pandul Hub. So today we are going to look into the Java interview questions, which is part 4, and especially we are going to concentrate on the marker interfaces. So what are marker interfaces? Marker interface is the interface which doesn't contain any field or method. So they are empty interfaces used to mark or identify a special operation. For example, clonable interface is used to mark cloning operation and serializable interface is used to mark serialization and deserialization of an object. So here, what does that marker interface say? According to Java is that this marker interface is not going to contain any field or method inside it. So what does that do then? If we don't have any method or field, why do we need a class? So here is the explanation for that. Looking carefully at marker interfaces in Java, like serializable, clonable, and remote, it looks they are used to indicate something to the compiler or JVM. So if JVM sees a class as serializable, it has done some special operation on it a similar way. If JVM sees a class to implement clonable, it performs some operation to support cloning. So what does happen is if you have a class which is going to implement a clonable or serializable interface, JVM JVM identifies that your class is extending or your class is implementing it, and it at the back end does some special operations so that your class is eligible to serialize your objects or clone your objects depending upon the class or depending upon the interface you have implemented. So in short, it is used to convey to the JVM or compiler that all the classes which implements particular marker interface have some specific behavior. So basically, marker interfaces are empty interfaces with no fields and methods, but they are used to mark particular class with some specific behavior so that JVM as a compiler would identify our class and mark that behavior defaultly on it based on the interface that we have implemented. So they are also known as tag interfaces since they tag all the derived classes into a category based on their purpose. For example, you have an employee class which you are implementing serializable interface to it. In that class, your class is tagged as a serializable interface, or the serializable property is tagged on your class, which is a derived class from the serializable interface. For example, all the class which implement serializable interface are eligible for serialization process. If we try to serialize an object of a class which has not implemented serializable interface, then it will throw not serializable exception. So in other words, just by marking a class serializable, we can make it eligible for serialization. Amazing, isn't? So it is basically we are making the JVM to understand that our class is tagged for serialization by implementing the serializable interface. So this way the JVM will understand that our class is specifically used or it needs the property of serializability added to it. So what are built-in marker interfaces? There are four main built-in marker interfaces in JDK. So first one is the serializable interface. Serializability of a class is enabled by the class implementing the Java IO serializable interfaces. So if you want a class to be serialized, then you have to implement the class using the serializable interface. To store any object via serialization mechanism, we call object output stream, and to deserialize that object, we call object input stream. So here I said, so this serializable interface being a marker interface, it doesn't contain any fields or methods. But just by implementing that interface, how can we serialize our objects? So because they don't have any variables, they don't have any methods, so how we are going to do it? So the way is the serialization mechanism is achieved using the object output stream and object input stream. So these two have the methods called the write object, which will serialize your object, and read object, which will deserialize your object. Okay, so the next one is a clonable interface. Objects clone method may be invoked on an instance for cloning. So once you have implemented your class using the clonable interface, you can use this object class clone method. Even the clonable interface doesn't have any variables or methods. So that should be remembered because the clonable is also a marker interface. So to help us the object to be cloned, we have to use the object class clone method so that that can be invoked on an instance for cloning. This interface allows the implementing class to have its objects to be cloned instead of using a new operator. So the benefit of this clonable interface is instead of using a new operator and creating a new object for the class, if you want a similar objects to be created, you can clone the existing objects and create a copies of it instead of using this new operator for creating an object. So the next is the random access interface. It is used by List implementations to indicate that they support fast, generally constant time and random access. So this interface is basically like some of the collections implement this interface so that the search process or the generally fast. So the list is one of the collections type which just implements this interface. I mean, which has, I mean, rightly said, it implements this interface. So remote interface, it serves to identify interfaces whose methods may be invoked from a non-local virtual machine. So this is also one of the marker interface which helps to invoke the methods from a non-local virtual machine. So what is serial version UID? What would happen if you don't define this? So serial version UID is an ID that is stamped on an object when it gets serialized, which is usually the hash code of an object. So whenever you do a serialization, there is a version ID which gets added to it, which is usually the hash code of the object that gets serialized. So one can use the tool serialver to see the serial version UID of a serialized object. So this tool can be used to see the serialized version ID of the object. The serial version UID is used for version control of the objects. So this ID helps us in version control of the objects. For example, if you are serializing an object and you want to deserialize it, so you can just go through, or we can just have an idea based on the version UID whether the object has undergone the change or not. So this can be mentioned in the class file also. The consequence of not specifying serial version UID is that when you add or modify any field in a class, then the already serialized class will not be able to recover because serial version UID generated for a new class and for the old serialized object will be different. So why we are having the serial version ID? Serial version UID, as I said, it acts as a version control concept for the objects. That is, when you are just serializing an object with one UID, and if there seems to be a modification in the class, so in that case, when you serialize the new class, the OID is going to be different. The UID is going to be different because the hash code of the object is also different as it is modified. In that case, both the serialized object have a different UIDs and have a different versions, and it implies that there has been a change in the class. So Java serialization process relies on correct serial version UID for recovering the state of the serialized object and throws invalid class exception in case of serial version UID mismatch. So if there happens to be the same scenario which I explained you before, so you have an object which is serialized using one UID and there happens to be a change in the class and now you're trying to deserialize it, but this throws an error because once you deserialize it, you're going to get an object which you're going to typecast to your own user defined class. So what I mean is, for example, you have an employee class. You're trying to serialize your employee class with one UID, one version UID. So now you're doing some modifications on the employee class. So now after the modification, you're trying to restore the serialized version or the serialized object of the employee. So now when you deserialize the stored version or the serialized version of the employee, it will throw an error because after serialization process, we have done some changes to the employee class, because of which when we try to deserialize it, it says it cannot match. There is a mismatch in the version UID. Can we create our own marker interface? If yes, how? Yes, we can create our own marker interface just by creating a blank interface. So in our code, we can use it as in method arguments or use it with instance of operator to execute code based on the type of the object. So here is an example. So we have an interface called myMarkerInterface and we have a class which implements this marker interface. Okay, so then you can, for example, have method taking only my marker interface instance. That is, you can invoke that by by adding the marker interface as a parameter to that method, or we can just execute it based on the type of the object. So the common problem with marker interface is that when a class implements them, all of its subclass by default inherits it. So one of the major problem or a concern or an issue or whatever it can be, the thing is like if a class A is implementing a serializable class and if there is a class B which is extending A, so B by default implements a serializable class. You cannot detach the serializable interface implementation from B because B is already associated to A and A is associated to serializable. So in ABO case, class B inheritably behaves as serializable. We cannot remove or unimplement serializable from it. We need to handle such exceptional cases by throwing exceptions from child classes. So this is one of the straight behavior of the serializable implementing classes. Can't we achieve the same behavior of marker interfaces with annotations? Why do we need marker interfaces and why this indication cannot be done using a flag inside a class? Yes. So the behavior of the marker interfaces can also be achieved using annotations. But even without using marker interfaces, why can't we make the class serializable or why can't we make the class clonable? Yes, we can, but this can also be done using a Boolean flag or a string. So as I already said, this can be done just by having a flag or a string or just having a logic, custom logic inside it. We can make a class to handle serializability or clonability or whatever the marker interfaces now we have. But marking a class like serializable or clonable makes it more readable and it also allows one to take advantage of polymorphism in Java. So here what it says is if you have your own logic inside a class to make or perform certain behavior, instead of doing that, if you mark a class like serializable or clonable just by implementing an interface, it helps us to tag a class and it is easy for a user readability. So apart from using a built-in marker interface for making a class serializable or clonable, one can also develop his own marker interface. The marker interface is a good way to classify code. You can create a marker interface to logically divide your code, and if you have your own tool, you can perform some pre-processing operations on those classes, particularly useful for developing API and frameworks like Spring or Struts. So where are the built-in marker interfaces? You say we have the serializable and clonable, which is which are the pre-written ones. But you can have your own things. So the places where you can use is if you want to divide your code for some particular uh, for particular API or frameworks, a string or struts, or you want certain operations to be separated from the code. So in that case, you can use this built-in marker interfaces. So most of the thing that can be done with marker interfaces can be done with annotations also. So as I previously mentioned, so we can have we can have the same behavior of the marker interfaces using the annotations also. Annotations can have parameters of various kinds and they are much more flexible. So unlike marker interfaces, annotations can have parameters, but marker interfaces don't have variables or fields or methods. After introducing annotations on Java 5, annotation would be a better choice than the marker interface. So one of the examples of annotations is JUnit is a perfect example of using annotation. Example at test. So for specifying a test class, we can just mention the annotation as at test, which will mark the class to be a test class. The same can also be achieved by using a test marker interface. So the same thing we can achieve using the test marker interface. But in some cases, marker interfaces have better performance. So in what cases? Just in one or two places. Like for example, to check if object is an instance of an interface at runtime, one can use instance of, which is a relatively low cost operation. Using annotations just to check type of the object at runtime is very high as it requires Java reflection calls, which is far more costly. So the second case is marker interfaces are better than annotations when they are used to define a type. For example, serializable can be used and should be used as the type of an argument that must be serializable. So an annotation doesn't allow doing that. So some of the places where we can define the serializable interfaces, that is the interface object, the interface type itself we can pass as a parameter, whereas the annotations we cannot do that. So how to restrict serialization of attributes declared in a class in Java? So it's fine that you're able to do a serialization and you're able to clone the objects. Everything is fine. So if you have a class and you have a set of properties and you want some of the properties not to be serialized during a serialization process, so how can you do that? So using the transient keyword, we can restrict the serialization of attributes in a class. So this is how it is. So for example, I have an employee class and I have these attributes like the personal info, name and ID. So I am making this personal info as a transient, and since once the JVM detects that this attribute to be transient, then it skips the serialization of this attribute in the employee class. So all the fields except the personal info can be serialized in this class. Thank you guys. Hope you would have got a very good idea on the marker interfaces. And for additional questions on additional topics, please do check my playlist. And if you like the video, please share and subscribe, and do watch the other parts for additional questions. And if you have any comments, please mention that in the comment section. Thank you.